The envelope came in gold foil and gilt. I almost didn't open it. It was late afternoon when I saw it, an elegant, overly self-important rectangle, resting on the cold edge of my marble countertop like a relic from a life I'd buried. Sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment, catching the edges of the foil in sharp reflection. I stared at it, unmoving. My tea had gone cold in my hands. 10 years. Not a birthday card, not a voicemail. I had all but convinced myself I was a ghost to them, and most days I preferred it that way. Now here it was, an invitation draped in excess, wrapped in silence. Christmas dinner. Full family presence expected. No return address. Just the West family crest in wax stamped arrogantly into the envelope flap like a threat. I didn't open it immediately. I let it sit there unopened for a full 37 minutes, as if staring it down might cause it to catch fire and spare me the choice. When my phone rang, I knew who it was before I checked the screen. Camille. My mother's voice whispered through the receiver like someone was listening. He wants to make things right. He asked for you by name. Silence filled the space between us. I should have hung up. I should have laughed. Instead, I asked, "He knows my name again." She hesitated. He never forgot. That was a lie. A soft, desperate one meant to pull me in like a string tugged by a puppet master. My mother had always been the quiet shadow behind my father's demands, always trying to soften the blow after the damage was done. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen island. The chill from the marble seeped into my skin. San Francisco in December wasn't brutal, but the cold had a way of pressing into your ribs. My apartment was modern, almost sterile, polished concrete, charcoal tones, sharp lines. I'd designed it to look like no one else had ever lived there. Clean, controlled, unlike the house I'd grown up in. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's just dinner. Come home, Camille. Just once." Home. What a generous word. I ended the call without responding. But I didn't throw away the invitation. Instead, I walked over to the small cabinet beneath my bookshelf, one I hadn't opened in years. The key was still taped to the underside of the bottom shelf, exactly where I left it. I unlocked the drawer and reached in, fingers grazing the black plastic casing of something old but familiar. The voice recorder was small, barely the size of a cigarette pack. I turned it over in my hands like a rosary, fingers resting on the play button. There were no recordings on it. Not yet. Just in case. They'd exiled me a decade ago. Told me I was impulsive, disloyal, ungrateful. Brandon had called me unstable. Elliot said I wasn't equipped for legacy. My father, Richard West, had simply said, "You are no longer needed." I'd left that night with a suitcase and a bank account containing exactly 4,127.36. Enough to disappear. Enough to survive. Barely. But I hadn't disappeared. Not completely. They assumed I stayed gone because I was broken. Because I had nowhere to go. They were wrong. I'd rebuilt myself from ash and arrogance. I'd used every ounce of rejection as fuel. I'd kept my last name not because I honored it, but because I intended to reclaim it on my terms. As I stared at the gold envelope again, I realized something with chilling clarity. This wasn't a gesture of peace. It was a setup. And this time, I'd be the one writing the ending. I opened my laptop and booked a one-way ticket to Colorado Springs. Not out of nostalgia. Not because I missed them. This was about something else. Retribution wears many faces. Mine would be wrapped in civility, cloaked in silence, and sharpened like a scalpel. I slid the recorder into my carry-on, zipped it shut. If they think they're inviting back the same girl they exiled, they're in for a new kind of reckoning. Every single view means a meal for someone in need. Just by watching this video, you're giving warmth, hope, and a full plate to those less fortunate. So watch now, share now, subscribe to the channel, and let's spread love together. Home didn't smell like cinnamon or childhood. It smelled like polished lies. The West Estate stood at the base of the Rockies like a monument to overcompensation. Snow lined the driveway in precise symmetrical plow patterns, and white lights wrapped around the porch columns in such calculated spirals they looked less like decorations and more like surveillance beacons. Even the wreath on the door had perfect symmetry. Nothing was left to chance in this family except me. I stepped through the grand entryway without a coat, the air inside just as cold. The smell hit me immediately, not of pine or mulled wine or fresh baking, but of varnish, lemon polish, and faint cigar smoke. No scent of cinnamon, no childhood. Just the sharp, sterile perfume of appearances. I hadn't set foot in this house since the night I was told to leave. That night, my father had spoken like a CEO terminating a liability, and my brothers stood behind him, silent partners in the purge. Diana, my mother, had reached for my wrist at the last moment, but even her touch had felt more like protocol than protest. Now, as I crossed the same marble floors in heeled boots that clicked like a metronome of restraint, I could almost hear echoes of that night. I remembered the slam of the door behind me, how the cold hadn't felt as brutal as the silence. Camille, a voice called from the hall, too bright, too rehearsed. My mother appeared with a soft smile and arms open just wide enough to be symbolic. Her hug landed halfway, barely grazing my back, before she pulled away, brushing invisible lint from my shoulder like a nervous tick. She looked thinner, her hair pinned too tightly, face smooth with the help of someone expensive. "You look sharp," she said. "I came straight from the airport." "We weren't sure you'd accept the invitation," she added, tone teetering between gratitude and caution. "I'm full of surprises these days," I said, walking past her toward the sitting room. Brandon was there, sprawled on one of the leather chairs, scrolling through his phone with a glass of scotch balancing on his thigh. He didn't look up. "Hey, stranger." He mumbled more to his screen than to me. "Still scrolling for your personality?" I asked coolly. His smirk twitched, half amusement, half irritation. Elliot entered next, wrapped in one of his tailored Christmas sweaters, a small plate of cheese in hand. He approached with exaggerated warmth, his smile stretching too wide. "Camille," he said, drawing out the name like it was foreign. "I didn't recognize you without your thesis clutched to your chest." I gave him a slow blink. "Must be hard recognizing women who say no to you." He chuckled falsely and clinked his glass against mine without waiting for permission. "Still spicy," he muttered. I scanned the room. The hierarchy hadn't changed. Brandon still lounged like he owned oxygen. Elliot hovered like he expected praise for simply existing. And Richard, he was nowhere to be seen, yet always making an entrance like a monarch returning from war. We moved to the dining room just before dusk. The table stretched so far it could seat a minor delegation. Candles flickered in perfect alignment, and the place cards, yes, place cards spelled out the seating arrangement like scripture. Mine sat at the very end opposite Richard. Symbolic again. When I sat, no one asked how I'd been. No one mentioned the decade of silence. It was as if I'd walked into a play midway through the performance and everyone had agreed to pretend I'd been here all along, just in a different seat. A less important one. Dinner arrived in courses I couldn't pronounce, plated on china. I remembered my mother hiding behind glass doors when we were kids. She poured me a glass of wine with shaking hands, saying nothing. "So Elliot began, is MIT still offering those intense little tech programs? Guess it finally paid off, huh?" The comment landed like a dart. Brandon smirked behind his glass. Richard, seated at the head of the table in a navy suit that hadn't seen sunlight in decades, remained silent. I didn't flinch. Instead, I let the wine linger on my tongue before swallowing. "That degree," I said, "lightly paid for my condo, my company, and my last vacation to Venice. So yes, worth it." My mother gave a faint smile, almost grateful. "I didn't come here to fight, not yet. I came to observe. Let them talk. Let them display themselves like always convinced they're untouchable." Richard finally lifted his glass. To legacy, he said, voice deep, measured. And to the sons who carry it forward. No one corrected him. No one even glanced in my direction. The words echoed through the chandeliered silence like a verdict. I studied my family, their familiar faces now distorted by a decade of distance and truth. I wasn't just on the outside, I was placed there with intention, but I didn't mind. Observation had always been my sharpest weapon, and this was just the beginning. I haven't said a word yet, but I'm about to say everything. It wasn't dinner, it was a coronation, and I was the ghost no one mentioned. The table glowed with gold-accented crystalware and too much ceremony. 12 seats, 12 plates, 12 carefully curated humans pretending this wasn't a pageant. I watched from my exile at the end of the table as the fire crackled softly behind Richard's chair, casting flickering shadows across his gray temples. Brandon sat to his right, Elliot to his left. Diana, ever elegant, flanked the other side of Brandon, her hands neatly folded on her lap, like she'd rehearsed being invisible. The staff moved like dancers behind us, silent and synchronized, pouring champagne, with such precision you'd think the bubbles carried secrets. I didn't drink. Not yet. No one had acknowledged my presence since I sat down. A cousin nodded vaguely across the roast beef, and Aunt Lorraine asked if I still did that engineering thing, but even that was muttered without eye contact. I could have been the daughter of a distant friend, the plus one of an absent guest. The effort it took to erase me without saying my name, it was impressive. Richard stood lifting his champagne glass but not raising his voice. He didn't need to. Tonight, he said, is not just Christmas Eve. It's a transition point. A milestone. Everyone stopped chewing. The fire snapped in the silence and someone dropped a fork. For 35 years, West Holdings has been my life's work, Richard continued. But no empire can thrive forever under one hand. It's time to pass the torch. Brandon smiled before anything was announced. Of course he did. He probably helped write the speech. I sipped water and folded my hands, watching like a juror waiting for a verdict I already knew. Richard turned to one of the staff who stepped forward with a leather folder, thick gold embossed, dramatic. As if the ceremony required documentation to feel permanent. These are the formalized appointments. Brandon as Chief Executive Officer. Elliot as Chief Operating Officer. Effective immediately. Brandon accepted the folder like it was the Ark of the Covenant and gave a small bow. Elliot patted his back, radiating self-congratulation. Applause broke out. Genuine, thunderous, punctuated by champagne flutes rising like a benediction. I didn't move. They were rewriting history in front of me, pretending there had only ever been 2 children, 2 heirs, 2 names worthy of legacy. Diana stared straight ahead. Her smile was frozen lips taut like wire eyes anchored to her plate. No one mentioned me, not even in passing. No role, no thanks. No, and Camille, who chose a different path. Nothing. I didn't want a title. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted anyone to flinch. But they wouldn't. Not unless I made them. I reached for the champagne bottle myself, uncorked it without ceremony, and poured a glass. The pop silenced the room. Richard paused, still standing still, holding his glass midair. I raised mine slightly, gaze fixed on the patriarch who'd erased me from his legacy with surgical precision. Should I pour my own glass, I said, or are women not part of the inheritance? The air tightened. Someone coughed. Richard's face didn't change, just a flicker in the eyes, a twitch of the jaw. But he smiled, measured and dismissive. Camille, he said, don't make this about you. The champagne was cold and sharp as it hit my tongue. I swallowed slowly, letting the weight of silence collapse around us like a stage curtain. I smiled back. Oh, I'm not. Not yet. They buried me in the footnotes. Forbes put me on the cover. The room they gave me wasn't mine anymore. It had once been a sanctuary lavender walls book stacked to the ceiling, a telescope by the window facing north. Now it was a holding cell for off-season decorations, dusty trunks, and forgotten relics of a family obsessed with image but allergic to memory. The only thing untouched was the bed frame. The mattress had been swapped for something firmer, guest-worthy. Even the curtains were different. Beige, non-committal. I didn't unpack. I never intended to stay. It was just after midnight when I heard the tap on my door, barely audible, almost conspiratorial. I opened it an inch. Caleb. 14, maybe 15 now, with the awkward limbs of someone still growing too fast. He looked up at me with wide eyes and whispered, "You're trending." I blinked. "What Twitter? Instagram? Everywhere. You're like famous. And not in a weird, aunt drinks too much wine kind of way. Like real famous." He held up his phone screen, tilted toward me. I saw the banner instantly. Forbes, the woman who built a billion-dollar automation empire. Below it, my photo black suit arms crossed, standing in the middle of a gleaming server warehouse. Behind me, rows of robotic arms conveyor belts and the logo of my company, Nova Logic. "Where'd you see this?" I asked. "Everyone's sharing it. It just dropped." I nodded once, gently closed the door, and reached for my iPad. The article loaded in seconds. Camille West, 33, founder and CEO of Nova Logic, has quietly revolutionized warehouse automation while turning down every ounce of family funding. "I wasn't trying to prove anything," she told Forbes. "I just didn't want to owe them a damn thing." Now valued at $2.8 billion, Nova Logic has partnered with the Department of Defense and major Fortune 500 companies. I scrolled through it slowly, like savoring a letter I'd written in another life. My photo was everywhere, at tech summits, ribbon cuttings, keynote stages. Smiling, yes, but always at the edge of something larger. They'd been so sure I'd disappeared into nothing. Instead, I'd built something that no one at this table could buy, inherit, or fake. I highlighted a quote mid-page, estranged from one of America's oldest family conglomerates. "West's trajectory proves success isn't always inherited, it's engineered." I didn't smile, but something settled. Outside my door, I heard muffled footsteps, then voices. "She did this behind our backs, Brandon. Was she even working in the States? I thought she moved to Switzerland or something." Elliot's voice, anxious and thin. The hallway was a little too close, the walls a little too thin. I spoke calmly, never raising my voice. "No," I said loud enough to slice through the quiet. "I did it after you turned your backs." Silence. I returned to my iPad, screenshotting the full article, each page more damning than the last. I clicked the AirPrint icon connected to the estate's printer, still listed as West Main, and sent 15 full-color copies to print in the downstairs office. Each article would land on the heavy oak tray that Brandon had once used for his father's memos. The same tray where I once placed a science fair ribbon, back in a time when I thought they'd care. This wasn't revenge. It was fact. She begins printing the article. One copy for each family member. In this house, words vanish. I brought something to make them stay. The kitchen was warmer than the rest of the house, intentionally so. Richard had always hated drafts, so Diana had sealed off the vents and kept the stove pilot lights on even in summer. Tonight it felt like a false hearth. A cocoon of heat that couldn't reach bone. Snow drifted outside in gentle curtains, catching on the edges of the French doors like sugar dust on glass. Inside, the world was still except for the slow shuffling of paper. My mother sat at the island, a stack of old recipe cards spread in front of her like relics of a forgotten language. Her glasses slipped low on her nose as she ran a finger along one of the edges, tracing the faded ink of someone else's handwriting. Possibly hers. Possibly mine. We used to bake together apple tart clove cookies, soft pretzels that never rose. She didn't notice me enter. Or maybe she did and chose to keep pretending otherwise. I stepped quietly toward the coffee pot, pouring myself half a cup, no cream. The mug had a chip near the handle. Familiar. Her voice cracked through the silence, low and tired. Couldn't sleep? Didn't try, I replied. She nodded the way people do when they want to acknowledge a moment but not engage with it. I walked to the stool across from her and sat down slowly. She still didn't look up. Are those the recipes from the cedar box? She blinked. You remember that? I remember what I wasn't allowed to take with me. Her hand paused mid-turn. Silence settled again. I had a question, I said, keeping my voice neutral. She looked up slowly. I placed my mug down carefully, letting the clink echo for emphasis. Did my letters ever reach Dad? There it was. The flinch. So slight you'd miss it if you didn't know her the way I did, down to the nerves she tried to coat in lavender oil and polite smiles. She blinked too slowly. I wrote 5 times that first year, I continued. Birthday, Father's Day, Christmas, then twice in the spring. They weren't dramatic, just updates. Her hand tightened around the edge of a recipe card. Still no answer. Camille, she began, voice fraying. You have to understand, he didn't want reminders. Every time your name came up, it led to shouting. He'd pace, drink, break things. And what did you want? I asked. I wanted peace, she said, almost begging. I wanted the shouting to stop. I wanted the house to stay calm. I thought if I just gave it time. I tapped my Apple Watch under the sleeve of my sweater, casually brushing my wrist. Recording started. Her voice dropped to a whisper. So I kept them. Your letters. I put them in the desk drawer with the tax forms, and I never gave them to him. My breath didn't change. My posture didn't shift. I just stared at her like I was waiting for a recipe to finish. He wouldn't have read them, she added too quickly. He would have just torn them apart. I tilted my head. So you protected peace by erasing your daughter. She turned away, eyes shining, but no tears fell. I stood slowly, coffee untouched. As I passed her, I paused by her shoulder. Thank you, I whispered, voice cold as the snow behind us. This was useful. Thank you. This was useful. Some inherit fortune, others inherit silence. I was done with both. The storage room above the garage smelled like rusted nails and mothballs. The air was stale, heavy with decades of avoidance. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the silence settle around me like dust. No one ever came up here unless forced, usually by a leak or a rodent. That made it perfect. The floor groaned under my boots as I moved between towers of poorly labeled boxes. Ex-Maz 2009 Attic Keep, Brandon College stuff. Somewhere in this graveyard of sentiment and insulation was the truth, or at least the paper trail of it. I'd learned something years ago: people hide the most damning things not in locked drawers but in plain, forgettable chaos. It's easier to bury guilt in cardboard than confront it. I found the tax box first. I remembered the shape, green lid, cracked handle. Diana's signature touch: mislabel something and hope no one opens it. I dug past folders of receipts and insurance policies, and there they were. Letters, 12 of them. My handwriting on every one, still sealed. The dates ranged from my sophomore year at MIT to the winter I spent in Berlin after the grant fell through. Each envelope was addressed the same: Richard West. Each one unread. I held them like they might combust. The ink had faded at the corners. I'd pressed hard when I wrote back then, probably out of spite. Beneath the stack was a small card yellowing with age. The handwriting was old-fashioned, looping and sharp. To Camille, the one with steel in her spine. Love, Nana. I let out a quiet breath. Nana had always seen more than she let on. Tucked inside the card was one of my early sketches, a prototype I'd mailed Dad during my junior year. It was messy but sharp, the edges of a concept that would later become the core of Nova's early AI logic board. I remembered that moment, sending it in desperation, thinking he might be proud. Instead, he'd said I should focus on more feminine goals. Now I saw the truth. He hadn't thrown it out. He'd just filed it away. I stared at the inked lines, the equations in the margins, my initials at the bottom. Rage didn't come. Not yet. Just a deep, cavernous confirmation. I wasn't erased. I was ignored. "What you doing?" Emily's voice startled me. She stood at the top of the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, her hair messy from sleep. "Nothing dangerous," I said. She stepped onto the landing. "That's where Mom keeps the old Christmas stuff." "Yeah." I held up a crumpled felt stocking. "I can tell." She giggled, then frowned. "Did you really build robots?" I smiled softly. "Still do." "Cool." She looked around, unsure of whether to stay or leave. "You should go back down," I said gently. "It's cold up here." She nodded and disappeared quietly, the way kids do when they understand something is fragile without needing it explained. Once alone, I went back to the box. At the very bottom, stuck between folders, I found something that didn't belong. A business card. The edges were creased, the font slightly outdated. Robert West Consultant. Independent Holdings. A phone number. No email. I hadn't seen or heard his name in over a decade. The brother Richard never spoke of. The one who left the family business under circumstances everyone pretended to forget. I stared at the card for a long moment. Then I pulled out my phone. It rang twice. A pause. Then a gravelly voice, sharp with recognition. "Took you long enough. I'm ready to finish what they buried." He taught me to read contracts, not conversations. So I recorded both. The study smelled of burnt cedar and legacy. Books lined the walls, but few of them had been opened in the past decade. Leather-bound volumes stood stiff and decorative like guards. Richard always cared more about appearance than application. Brandon was the same, just louder. I stepped inside as the sun broke through the west window, lighting the dust motes like golden static. Richard sat at the desk, glasses perched low, scribbling on a legal pad in that fast, slanted hand of his. Brandon leaned over the arm of a leather chair, tapping a pen against his teeth like a metronome of entitlement. They looked up at the same time, same face, 2 levels of wear. I was hoping I said smoothly to ask a few things about the West Foundation. Specifically, the new board appointments. Brandon scoffed. "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" I ignored him. Richard took off his glasses, folded them neatly, and set them on a marble coaster. "The foundation's structure doesn't concern you anymore, Camille. Just curious." I walked to the fireplace, warming my hands for effect. Given my name's been in the news, some donors might get confused. Richard chuckled without humor. "Your article was a profile piece, not a pedigree." Brandon didn't wait his turn. "It doesn't change the will." There it was. I turned slowly, studying them like I might a slow-moving avalanche. "You're sure that's the angle you want to take?" He stood. "You're not going to threaten us with publicity. This family survived worse." "Did we?" I asked quietly. Richard sighed. "Camille, this isn't personal. You left. You chose your path. We respected that." "No, I said you exploited it. And my Apple Watch had been recording since I walked in." I let the moment dangle. No one noticed. Not the flicker of red light beneath my sleeve. Not the stillness in my spine that came from restraint, not reverence. Brandon paced a little. He always did when the walls started inching closer. "You come back here, act like some tech messiah, and think we owe you a throne." I tilted my head. "I think you're mistaking independence for intrusion." Richard raised a hand. "Enough. This is Christmas." "Is it?" I smiled softly and walked to the bookshelf. My fingers trailed along the spines, dust-covered first editions, unread treatises, tax law manuals they'd never opened. Then I turned and walked out. As soon as I was in the hallway, I pulled out my phone and clipped the last 22 seconds of audio. Brandon's voice raised Richard's justification, my calm rebuttal. "Send to Robert West." It took 6 minutes for the reply to arrive. "Robert. That's enough to open the first door." I leaned against the wall just outside the study. Their muffled voices continued, but I no longer needed them. Let's see what's behind it. They didn't know I was coming. That made it better. The boardroom hadn't changed in 12 years. Same mahogany table, same mounted buckheads, same uncomfortable silence lacquered into the wood grain. Even the water pitchers stood like forgotten props, beads of condensation gathering on their glass shoulders. I walked in first, uninvited, unannounced, and deliberately early. A thin folder rested in my hand like a scalpel. Behind me, Robert stepped in quietly, wearing a charcoal suit that said less about fashion and more about readiness. His tie was crooked, but his stare was razor-sharp. Brandon and Elliot were already seated, flanked by their posturing egos and steaming mugs of black coffee. Diana sat near the corner, flipping through a paper that wasn't printed that morning. Her fingers trembled slightly. Brandon didn't look up from his phone. "This is a private session." "That's funny," I said, taking the chair opposite him. "Because my name's on the original incorporation file." Elliot blinked. "What?" I set the folder down. "Meet Robert West, founding partner of West Holdings. Also my legal counsel." Robert gave a nod. His presence seemed to suck the temperature out of the room. Brandon straightened. Elliot's eyes darted to the door, then to Diana. She looked away. "You brought him back," Brandon said, his voice curdled. Robert ignored him. He pulled out a single-page document, yellowed at the edges but preserved in a plastic sleeve. Clause 16, paragraph 3, dated 1993. Signatures from all founding members, including Richard West. The clause identifies a contingency succession path. I tapped the page. Contingency meaning if both sons were deemed unfit or compromised by conflict of interest, then the remaining equity and governance may be transferred. Robert finished to the third registered beneficiary, Camille West. Brandon laughed. Loud, performative. "This is ridiculous. That clause was ceremonial." "No," I said. "Your title was ceremonial. This is structural." Elliot paled. "Is this real?" Robert handed him the document. "We can validate the copy against filings with the Colorado Secretary of State, but I think your father remembers signing it." All heads turned toward the end of the table. Richard wasn't there. The silence grew legs and climbed the walls. Diana finally spoke, her voice soft. He excused himself. He said this wasn't necessary." "No," I corrected. "He said I wasn't necessary. Now that I am, he's suddenly absent." Brandon's jaw clenched. "You came back to stir shit during Christmas. That's all this is." I leaned in, slowly, deliberately. "I didn't come back to beg. I came to balance the ledger." Robert folded his hands. "You'll find it's more than a bluff. We have the documentation, and should this reach a formal hearing, the optics won't favor exclusion based on gender or presumed absence." Elliot stood up. "We need a break." I stood as well. "By all means. Just remember, this time the room doesn't lock from your side." Brandon moved to his father's seat, leaned down close, and muttered something. But the acoustics in that room were made for echoes. "We need to shut this down. Fast." A golden cage is still a cage, especially when the lock is made of guilt. The door to Richard's office closed behind me with a soft click. Expensive hinges never squeaked. Everything in this room was engineered for control: the deep walnut walls, the over-oiled leather chairs, the low lights that made everyone lean forward as if to beg. Richard poured whiskey into 3 crystal tumblers, each one a message. "This is a peace offering. This is a performance. This is power poured neat." "Let's be civil," he said, handing me a glass. "Just us." But it wasn't just us. Brandon lounged near the fireplace like a bored prince. Elliot stood by the bookshelf, shifting from foot to foot. Diana hovered by the doorway as if summoned but not truly included. "We thought it was time to reset expectations," Richard said. He gestured toward a padded folder on the table. "A role fitting your accomplishments." VP of Public Innovation. Sounds impressive? I murmured, not opening it. Elliot brightened, trying to soften the blow. We also thought about rebranding the West Labs division, maybe the Camille Wing. It's high visibility, great optics. Brandon chuckled. Let her have her playground. She wants credit, right? I took a sip of the whiskey. It burned like varnish. You think this is about credit? I asked. Richard gave his best patriarchal smile. No. It's about family. Reconciliation. The press doesn't need to know every internal shift. We keep it clean. Private. You want me quiet? I said, voice flat. With a title that doesn't touch strategy, no voting rights, and a plaque that polishes your image. Brandon smirked. It's a good deal considering. I slid the whiskey aside and opened my own folder. Pages flipped like warning signs. This, I said, tapping a spreadsheet, is a falsified operations budget from Q3, filed under Elliot's digital signature. Elliot stiffened. That's what are you talking about? I turned the page. Duplicate expense lines. Vendor accounts that don't match receipts. Cross-checked with the SEC's new reporting AI. Robert flagged it this morning. Diana gasped softly. Brandon moved, but I held up a hand. Don't bother. There's more. I leaned forward. You want me to pretend we're unified. But your numbers are cooked. You want silence in exchange for guilt money and a glorified label. Richard's eyes were tired now, less glass and more gravel. I'm trying to save this family from imploding. I don't want your scraps, I said, standing. I want the truth in daylight. Elliot whispered something to Brandon. Diana looked at the floor, and Richard, slow and deliberate, set down his glass. Then you'll destroy us. I met his gaze. Only the parts that rot. Every empire hides a vault. I found mine in the attic. It started with a creak. Not the kind from an old board or shifting pipe, this one came from memory. The attic door above Richard's study was supposed to be permanently sealed after renovations. But when I pushed against the molding, it gave with a reluctant sigh, dust curling into the hallway like smoke from a long-buried fire. The wooden ladder groaned under my weight. It felt symbolic. I stepped into the dark, brushing past cobwebs and years of insulation-stained neglect. Forgotten ledgers were piled in bankers' boxes marked with years in fading Sharpie, 2006, 2011, 2017. An external hard drive blinked faintly on a shelf like it was holding its breath. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, just that I would know it when I saw it. I was elbow deep in a box labeled Vendor Records, Q2, when a beam of light struck my face. Are you robbing the house? Emily's voice floated up behind me, more curious than alarmed. I blinked, caught mid-rummage pages in my lap. She was holding a flashlight and a peanut butter sandwich. I didn't answer right away. I like puzzles, she said. And secrets. Can I help? Her honesty disarmed me more than her flashlight. Close the door behind you, I said, making space on the floor. She sat cross-legged beside me, her flashlight swinging like a detective's torch. Together we sifted through records. Some were mundane catering bills, floral invoices, logistics for gala events. But then patterns began to emerge. Invoices that looked legitimate. Until you noticed the same vendor appearing twice, under slightly different names. SpringTech Solutions and SpringTech Sol. Addresses 2 digits apart. Dates staggered by hours, each amount just below internal review thresholds. Emily hummed. This looks fake, because it is. I set another sheet aside. Here's Elliot's sign-off. Again and again. We stacked the duplicates in a separate pile. I opened the hard drive, password protected but not immune to Emily's guest dad's birthday click. The folders weren't even hidden. Just labeled in codes only a guilty conscience would find: clever legacy budget, final V4, and tax buffer sheets. My fingers flew. Screenshots, PDFs, scans, attachments. Everything zipped and encrypted. I called Robert. He answered on the second ring. Talk to me. I found the rest, I said. Double invoicing, vendor laundering, and Elliot's approval trail. Silence. Then send it. All of it. We'll tie it to external audits. And Camille, this is enough. I hit send. I watched the file upload bar crawl toward completion. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt surgical. Emily stood. Will this fix it? No, I said softly, but it might make it impossible to ignore. I opened a blank document on my laptop. Press release. West Holdings under internal review. Following audit discrepancies. I began typing. Calm, deliberate, controlled detonation. I paused, stared at the blinking cursor, and whispered, they used my silence. Now I'll use their math. My phone buzzed. Text from Robert, ready to go public. Some people burn bridges. I light the whole map. The winter room smelled like artificial pine and expensive regret. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the snow-covered estate like a curated backdrop. A crystal punch bowl sparkled on the credenza. Strings of soft white lights lined the crown molding. There was no music, just the faint clink of cutlery and too much politeness. Every detail screamed curated reconciliation, as if redemption could be catered. Photographers milled silently, their lenses aimed like quiet rifles. A woman in a navy pantsuit, someone from the PR team, likely stood against the far wall tablet in hand eyes, flicking between Brandon and Richard. This wasn't a celebration. It was containment. I stood near the fireplace, glass of untouched champagne in hand, wearing black. I hadn't spoken a word since I entered the room. Not when Diana tried to compliment my dress. Not when Elliot fumbled through an over-rehearsed toast about family resilience. And not even when Brandon, smug as ever, raised his flute and said, "To putting the past behind us." It was Richard who tried to close the performance with finality. Today, he said, stepping forward, we begin a new chapter. Let our legacy be defined not by old wounds, but by unity. A soft applause followed. Flashes from cameras popped. Diana stood beside him, hands clutched like she was praying without faith. I walked to the front of the room without being called. The air changed. People shifted. A few cousins set down their drinks. Robert, seated near the back, gave the smallest nod. Showtime. I have a gift, I said. A short slideshow. No one objected. That was their mistake. The screen flickered to life behind me. Slide 1, an internal memo from 2018 with Elliot's signature on an inflated vendor invoice. Slide 2, audio, Brandon scoffing. Let her have her playground, followed by Richard's voice agreeing the will needed clarity. Slide 3, a spreadsheet, duplicate payments routed to shell entities. Whispers. Then noise. What is this? Brandon barked. Evidence. Robert answered, rising. Authenticated files pulled from your own archives. Turn that off, Elliot snapped. This isn't how we handle things. No, I said this is how I handle things. The slideshow kept cycling pages, signatures, a clipped voicemail from Diana confirming she withheld my letters. It was methodical. Impersonal. Like performing an autopsy with PowerPoint. Stillness took over the room. The PR woman's face went white. Richard didn't move, not even a breath. I'm not here to take your chairs, I said. You already filled them with rot. I'm here to take back my name. I stepped aside to let the final slide settle, a scanned copy of the original incorporation clause, signed by all 3 founding partners, including Robert. It named me, Camille R. West, as the contingency successor in the event of dispute, death, or ethical compromise. The clause had been buried literally in a filing box Robert had found during one of his late-night dives into West Holdings' archives. No board vote required, Robert added, voice steady. Per this clause, Camille was always next in line. Elliot's jaw tightened. Brandon was visibly shaking his fists, balled at his sides. This is a stunt, he spat. Robert didn't even blink. Then sue us. But first explain to the IRS those forged vendor payments. I watched Richard closely. He didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He simply blinked once and took a long sip of whiskey. You always knew, I said quietly. His eyes met mine, calm as a dying fire. I underestimated how much bitterness a brilliant girl could carry. Wrong again, I replied. It's not bitterness, it's arithmetic. I just brought a calculator. Then I turned to the rest of the room. Let's be clear, this isn't revenge. Revenge would be petty secretive beneath me. This is return, and exposure, and a correction. Murmurs swelled. Some of the extended family looked horrified. Others, mostly younger, leaned in with something like admiration, even pity, maybe awe. I built an empire outside of this house, I continued. I never needed your approval, but I'm reclaiming what was denied. And in doing so, I'm offering something better. A new slide appeared, the logo of the West Innovation Fund, sleek, modern, unmistakably mine. The West name has meant exclusion, silence, control. This fund will redefine it, focused on women-led startups, independent engineers, and kids who send prototypes to parents who never open them. Robert cleared his throat. Funded entirely by Camille. $2.8 billion in assets, independently managed and already IRS approved. Brandon looked like he might combust. Richard said nothing. But Diana, quietly trembling, stepped out from his side and moved toward me. For the first time in over a decade, she stood beside me, not behind anyone else. She didn't touch me, just stood still, present, seen. I turned to the room again and raised my glass. My champagne had gone flat, but that didn't matter now. Now the room feels warmer, doesn't it? Bloodlines aren't blueprints. Sometimes the house must be redesigned. Snow was falling in slow, unhurried spirals, thick enough to blur the patio lights, soft enough to silence the crunch beneath our boots. My coat was still buttoned wrong from the chaos of the night, but my pulse had finally leveled. For the first time since stepping back into this house, I didn't feel like a ghost in my own story. Diana stood beside me, arms wrapped tight around her ribs as if she were still holding in something dangerous. We hadn't spoken since she stepped away from Richard and stood by me in that cursed winter room. But now, in the hush of snowfall and distance from the others, her voice broke the silence. I wasn't protecting your father, she said, barely louder than the breeze. I was protecting my fear. The sentence landed like a soft slap. Not cruel, not meant to injure, but still real. Still bruising. You chose survival, I said after a pause. I chose exile. Neither of us were free. She looked at me then. Really looked. I used to think your silence was punishment. She said, eyes rimmed red. But now I see it was armor. The porch light flickered. Somewhere inside I heard Brandon's voice slam against a wall, angry, panicked, trying to recover control of a ship already half sunk. Diana reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small box. It was matte black, velvety at the edges, like something that had been touched too many times in private and never spoken of aloud. I kept one thing, she said. Only one. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. She handed it to me. Inside, nestled in faded tissue paper, was the prototype sketch I had mailed from MIT when I was 19, the automation module I had drawn by hand, shaded in pencil, annotated with my usual perfectionism. Small enough to wear, strong enough to remember, the caption read. I knew your father mocked it, Diana said. But I couldn't. I didn't want it lost. My fingers trembled as I ran them over the edges. Time had yellowed the paper, but my name was still clear at the bottom. Not signed, etched. You knew what he did, I whispered. I knew what he didn't do, she replied. He didn't see you. From behind us came the sudden slam of the patio door, followed by hurried footsteps on the icy concrete. Emily burst out, cheeks flushed from cold and something deeper. Aunt Camille, she cried, rushing toward me. Uncle Brandon said girls don't run companies. He said you're just mad. I knelt down, brushing snow off her sleeves. Well, he's half right. I am mad, but not about being a girl. Diana crouched beside me and gently wiped the tears from Emily's face with the corner of her scarf. That's what your aunt is for, she said softly. To prove him wrong. Emily sniffled and nodded, her little face hardening like wet clay meeting fire. I stood again, pulling her gently into a hug as Diana rose beside us. We stood there for a long moment, 3 generations between snowflakes and silence the cold, no longer something to fear. Emily eventually slipped from our arms and wandered to the edge of the patio, tracing shapes into the fresh layer of snow with her boots. I watched her draw a circle, then cross through it with a single line. She's going to remember tonight, I said, eyes still on Emily. Diana nodded. Good. Maybe she'll forget the rest. The silence between us settled into something no longer heavy. It was just honest. For the first time in my life, my mother and I weren't pretending to be anyone else. Not diplomats. Not ornaments to a legacy we never chose. I used to want to tear this place down, I admitted. Brick by brick. Diana exhaled sharply, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief. I wanted to run away, but I didn't know where to go. You stayed, I said. You left, she answered. We both looked out over the snowy lawn that stretched toward the woods, unspoiled by footprints. A pristine white sheet waiting for history to walk all over it again unless someone decided to write a different story. Do you think it's too late? Diana asked. To fix what we broke, I turned to her. We didn't break it. We just stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. She lowered her gaze, then nodded slowly. Then let's stop pretending. For a moment it felt like the end of something, a final breath, a chapter closed. But then I looked at Emily, still drawing her quiet rebellion into the snow, and I knew it wasn't the end. It was the start of something sharper. I walked to the edge of the patio, snow crunching beneath my boots, and stood beside my niece. She looked up at me, expectant. I knelt beside her and whispered, "We build from the cracks, not the blueprints." Her eyes widened. What if it breaks again? Then we build smarter. Diana joined us. Her arms folded, not in defense but in witness. Her coat flapped in the wind, revealing the sketch she had tucked inside my sketch, peeking from her pocket, like a quiet promise. Behind us, the lights inside flickered. Someone was yelling again. Brandon, probably. Or Elliot. Maybe both. The house rattled with panic denial and all the desperation of men who just realized the storm wasn't over, it had only just begun. I stood tall, the wind slicing across my face, the snow now falling faster. If they want war, I said softly, mostly to myself, but loud enough for Diana to hear, they'll get a reckoning. Then I looked down at Emily and added louder this time. But first we protect the girls. Empires don't fall in silence. They shatter like glass under truth. The first fracture came at 9:03 a.m. Eastern Time. Brandon had barely stepped into the marble lobby of West Holdings when the boardroom doors opened, not to greet him, but to eject him. Men and women in sharp suits and sharper expressions stood waiting, their silence louder than any rebuke. "The board has convened," said Deborah Lang, head of compliance. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your executive duties. Security will escort you to your office to collect personal items only." Brandon blinked, once the confidence draining from his posture. On what grounds? Knowingly approving falsified financial statements. Internal audit findings have been forwarded to the SEC. Deborah replied, crisp as a guillotine. He turned to Elliot, who was already seated at the long glass table inside. Pale, sweating, and wordless, Elliot had a printed copy of Camille's slideshow in front of him, highlighted, annotated, damning. His initials circled in red on doctored vendor invoices. Emails time-stamped at midnight, desperate and incriminating. Richard did not attend. He hadn't left the estate in 2 days. Camille arrived at 10:42 a.m., legally summoned not as a daughter, but as a whistleblower. She wore a dark navy coat, no makeup, and a measured stillness that unsettled the room more than any fury could have. Robert walked beside her briefcase in hand, his demeanor calm and lethal. At 11:15, the SEC agents arrived. At 11:40, an official memo was circulated. Elliot West had tendered his resignation effective immediately. Camille made no public comment. She didn't need to. At 12:15 p.m., news vans circled the downtown office like vultures over fresh carcass. Reporters shouted her name across barricades. She stopped once just outside the rotating doors and spoke into a sea of microphones. "This isn't a fall, it's a redesign." Inside, she sat across from the interim chair of the board and requested severance packages for all non-executive employees. No one else should pay for their mistakes, she said. But the optics, a director began. Camille raised a hand. "I'm not asking for optics. I'm asking for dignity. Start there." At 2:30 p.m., Richard called. She let it ring twice before answering. "You've destroyed your home," he said, his voice frayed. She didn't flinch. "You never let me rebuild it. I gave you everything." "No," she said quietly. "You gave my brothers everything. You gave me silence." There was a long pause. Then he hung up. At 4:07 p.m., Diana stood behind a podium at a press conference outside the West Innovation Fund headquarters. For the first time in decades, her voice wasn't tentative. "My daughter has not destroyed this family," she said. "She has exposed what was already collapsing. And in its place, she is building something honest, something worthy of carrying our name." Behind her, Camille remained still, eyes fixed on the skyline. Emily stood beside her, clutching a folder with Camille's Forbes cover inside her small face, glowing with something like pride. The final blow came later that night. An alert flashed across national news outlets. West Holdings under federal investigation. Daughter spearheads innovation shift. No champagne, no applause. Just the echo of consequences. Camille didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. But she did close her laptop, slide it into her bag, and say, "Now we build." Every single view means a meal for someone in need. Just by watching this video, you're giving warmth, hope, and a full plate to those less fortunate. So watch now, share now, subscribe to the channel, and let's spread love together. Last year, I watched this table break me. This year, I set it. The scent of roasted thyme and baked apples drifted through my home long before the guests arrived. For once, I didn't care if the roast was perfect. I cared about who would be sitting at the table. The table itself was simple oak, long and unfussy, not lacquered to impress but chosen to gather. I laid down matte black plates, gold-rimmed glasses, and small white cards with handwritten names. Emily, Diana, Robert, Caleb, Sophia, Lynn, Mina. 7 seats, each one intentional. Last year, the West Estate had 12 chairs. Only 3 had mattered. Now, all 7 mattered equally. Emily hovered nearby, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. "Is it weird I kind of love Brussels sprouts now?" I smiled, handing her the bowl. "Growth happens in strange places. Like garages," she quipped, referencing my startup origin story. The girl had learned fast. Laughter echoed from the living room, where Diana and Robert were deep in a mock debate about whether cranberry sauce belonged on a dinner plate or in the trash. "It's not a condiment, it's an intrusion," Robert declared. "Oh, please," Diana retorted, her tone light, playful. "You said the same thing about my daughter once." My eyes met hers across the kitchen archway. No shame, no apology, just warmth. For the first time, it was real. As everyone settled into their seats, Robert stood and raised his glass. To the woman who didn't just build tech, she rebuilt truth. And in doing so, reminded the rest of us how to use our spine. Laughter, cheers, and for once, no one looked to see if Richard approved. We ate, we talked, we listened. Caleb asked one of the young founders, Sophia, how she convinced investors at 19. She grinned and said, "I stopped asking permission." Emily slid a small box across the table to me. "Open it," she urged, eyes wide. Inside a folded piece of paper and a hand-drawn logo, West Fund for Girls Who Build. The W was shaped like a circuit board, a little crooked, a little brave. I swallowed the knot rising in my throat. "I had help," she added shyly. "Grandma did the coloring." Diana smiled at me this time without fear or pretense. She asked what legacy meant. I told her it starts at the dinner table. We moved to dessert. I served slices of my mother's old recipe apple pie with cheddar crust, reclaimed just like everything else. After the table had been cleared and the room had faded into soft music and low conversation, I stepped out onto the balcony. The San Francisco skyline twinkled, not unlike Colorado's snow, but here it didn't bite. I pulled out my phone. Dozens of unread messages, but one sat at the top, blinking quietly. Time magazine, honoree, confirmation pending. I tapped the notification, read the subject line again, then locked the screen without replying. That could wait until tomorrow. Tonight I had set the table, and everyone at it had earned their place. Some legacies are handed down, others are carved one scar at a time. The sun was bleeding into the bay, San Francisco draped in that gold-pink hush only winter can cast. I stood on my rooftop with a flute of champagne in one hand and the silence of earned solitude in the other. I had promised myself I wouldn't check email tonight. Promised I'd let the peace breathe even for just one evening, but some promises bend for the right kind of disruption. The subject line waited for me like a held breath. Time 100 nomination, confirmed. The email was brief, efficient, and strangely warm. Camille West, you have been selected for inclusion in the Time 100 list of most influential individuals for your leadership in ethical innovation and corporate transparency. I read it twice. Then again. There was no joy dance, no champagne shower, just an exhale. I didn't want fame. I wanted proof. Not for them, for me. That the girl they buried had clawed her way through silence and risen not louder but clearer. My phone buzzed. "Mom." I answered on the second ring. "You alone?" Diana asked. "For once, yes. I won't keep you long. I wanted to say I'm proud of you. I was just slow to see you." I let the quiet settle. "You saw me when it counted." She chuckled softly. Emily made a tiny poster. It says, "Aunt Camille, Time Traveler." She doesn't quite get the list yet. She gets more than most adults, I said. We hung up a few moments later. The kind of call you tuck in your coat pocket like a letter you plan to reread. The knock at my door was sharp, precise. No one buzzed up. I opened it to find a man in a black cap, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Camille West." "Yes. You've been served." He handed me a thick envelope and left without another word. I already knew what was inside before I tore the seal. "Legal notice: you are hereby named in a lawsuit for defamation, breach of fiduciary trust, and corporate sabotage. Filed by West Ventures, LLC, a shell company. Not a new enemy, just a familiar coward with a new mask." They had created another front thinking a new name would shield the same rot. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I simply walked to the steel fire pit at the corner of the roof, struck a match, and fed the notice to the flames. Pale orange licked the corners of the paper. Legal language turned to smoke. Accusations curled into ash. Then I went inside, sat at my laptop, opened a blank document, typed 3 words at the top: statement from Camille West. They wanted a war. They'd get a reckoning. But this time, on my terms and my language, with no table left to be silenced at. They thought they'd started another war. I've just begun my legacy.